Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. Like Claire said, I'm going to do a session on RCTs and focusing on the history of RCTs in children's social care. I do have a cold, so apologies for the kind of blocked nose and sore throat and coughing that will inevitably happen. This is the first of two webinars I'm doing today, so I'm hoping my voice will survive the afternoon, fingers crossed. So this is partly based on a slide's not moving. Second on the wrong screen. So yeah, so part of this is based on a book that I'm one of the editors of. That's coming out later this year, so it's coming out in September. It's a collection of different chapters focused on different case examples of randomized trials in children's social care. A lot of these studies have happened in the last few years because there's been a big increase in RCTs. So it's a good example of lots of different case studies, some critiques. And the chapter that I'm basing this talk on is the first chapter, which is the history of RCTs. And I was interested in how we kind of got to this point where we've got quite a few RCTs in recent years, but there's been a long period where there weren't many. And I thought looking at other fields that were kind of related to children's social care or adjacent to see what happened there is a good way of understanding that sort of trajectory. The chapter is the title's up there. You can see this is a quote from a service manager.
Before, just so we can still see the notes slide. I don't know if you're able to fix that. I don't know if you want us to see all of your notes.
It doesn't really matter, to be honest. I can try that.
Okay, just so you're aware. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Finally. So hopefully you can now see the chapter. So this is a quote from a service manager from a number of years ago when we were setting up a study and proposing that we would randomize families to either go to a social worker who had a particular training or to one who hadn't. And this sort of shows his concern that we were potentially randomizing families. And I think this is sort of a theme that comes up again and again. This is something I've been trying to get into print for years. But the publisher was concerned about the rude words, so we settled on the asterisks to sort of block it out. But essentially, that's what the chapter's called. I'm going to start. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I'll start with what is an RCT, because not everyone will know what a randomized trial is, and then we're going to do a kind of historical overview, starting in the 1930s through to the sort of present day. If we've got time, hopefully talk about a few recent studies that we've done. And some thoughts about the kind of conditions that you might need in the sort of research community to ensure that we continue to have opportunities to do randomized trials in the future. So what is an RCT? Well, a randomized controlled trial is essentially a really good way of estimating the impact of an intervention. And if you want to do that, you essentially need to do a comparison of some sort. And there are lots of different ways you could create a comparison group. You could choose two different cities. You could lots of different ways of doing it. You could match people on certain characteristics that you might know about. And essentially you want to see whether there's a difference between having an intervention and not having it. Obviously you can't do that. You can't have a person who's both had something and not had something. So you have to have two groups of people to compare. The beauty of a randomized trial is that you're able to, by randomly assigning people to the two groups, you end up, if you do it properly, you end up with two groups that are equally distributed in terms of characteristics, and that's both things that you know about them and things you don't. Because even with matching, you can match people on certain characteristics, age, and all sorts of things. But there is always going to be things you don't know that you can't match on. So randomized control trial, if you do the randomization successfully, you should end up with two groups that are comparable, both differences that are known and unknown. There's a sort of diagram here. So you take your kind of population on the left, your sample, you split them into two groups randomly. Lots of different ways of randomizing, but often it's done by kind of spreadsheets. One group has the intervention, one group carries on as normal, and then you measure outcomes normally at the start to get a baseline, but also at the end, and then you might do follow-ups as well to see what difference the intervention's made. Now, there's lots of discussion about RCTs. You'll hear people saying lots of things, particularly in relation to social work RCTs. People say there aren't many around, but then you might find For example, Bruce Thayer did an article where he collected together, I think, something like 500 RCTs that have been done in social work. So there's lots of debate about whether they're common or whether they're not done very much. People will say they're practically impossible. They're difficult to do in children's services organisations. You're coming in and you're not just observing or collecting data, you're actually trying to change how practice works in most cases. So there can be opposition to that. People say they're ethically unjustifiable. People say it's not ethically okay to randomise people. People say that they're borrowed from medicine, so obviously they're used a lot in medicine, and I think there's a perception that they've kind of been adopted in children's social care. People also say they're not a very useful type of evidence, because although they might tell you the impact of something, they don't necessarily tell you why and how it has that impact. So there's lots of discussion about RCTs, but until recently, not very many RCTs had been done, certainly not in the UK. If we start in the 1930s, like I said, this is kind of although the idea had been around for a long time, I think this is the first sort of time when changing the slides by mistake, where social science RCTs started being used. So the first person who kind of wrote about this is R.A. Fisher, who you might have come across. He's a statistician. He's given his name to various tests, but he was an agricultural worker working in the southeast of England in the 1930s. And his book, which he published in 1935, kind of popularized this method that he'd used in his agricultural research. At the time, there was lots of the geneticists were coming up with lots of new plant varieties, and there was a need to figure out how best to grow them. And there were different ways of doing that. So he tested different methods of agriculture. Arguably the first sort of social work RCT, but it's certainly considered the first criminology RCT, was the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study, which was in the late 30s or mid 30s. This compared a psychosocial intervention for boys who were considered at risk of offending. It had a sample of over 500 boys, and it's the first example, I think, of a really counterintuitive finding. So it found actually that the treatment group, so the boys who had the intervention, ended up more likely to offend at the end. And that's something that you see a few times over the course of history, a trial that has a really surprising finding, things that the intervention actually made things worse. So the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study is a sort of a really important study in the kind of history of RCTs. And I think lots of social work interventions are similar to this intervention that was tested in that study. During the war, there were also some randomized trials. So there's some testing of propaganda methods, things to boost troops' morale, but also sort of civilian public service announcements. These posters on the slide will be things you might have seen before, the kinds of things they had on the tube and so on. In 1941, Archie Cochrane, who's sort of famous for popularizing RCTs in medicine, was in Greece as a prisoner of war. He did his first RCT. He was concerned about some his fellow prisoners of war had swollen ankles, so he tested different methods of addressing that. And his paper, it's called Sickness in Salonika. It's a really interesting paper. It's really available online. It's something I'd recommend reading. But that was kind of his first foray into the idea of randomizing. And then he obviously went on to do big things after that. So you've got this sort of different people from different fields kind of coalescing around the same ideas in the sort of 30s and 40s. But I think that the Cambridge Somerville trial in particular had quite a big impact because obviously a negative finding. It found that the intervention harmed people. It was interpreted by some as a failure of methodology, and this is something we come up against time and again. And there was other studies where sort of disappointing results meant that people kind of shied away from doing RCTs. And Anna Oakley, who's a sort of famous sociologist, described this as a retreat into qualitative methods. Not to denigrate qualitative methods, but I think if you're trying to find out the impact of something, then they're not as good as quantitative methods for impact. As a result, the following couple of decades, the 40s and 50s, they weren't really used very much in social policy. And Peter John, who's an academic at King's College London, describes the trajectory as a kind of cycle. So there's cycles of increased and decreased use of RCTs, and I think this is the first sort of downturn, I suppose. In the decades after that, so 1960s, 1970s, the social work profession went through a lot of change. So there's a lot of context to this, which I talk about in the chapter, but in particular, there are some very high-profile child deaths. So the first of the kind of high-profile tragedies that kind of got a national platform, I suppose, is the death of Maria Cole in the early 70s. The Nigel Parton's book is the picture on the screen on the slide there is a really good book that kind of goes into the politics of that and the kind of moral panics that then sort of came after that. But that also increased the public's awareness of social work and what social workers do, increased demand, and as a result, the workforce grew. But there was a kind of sense that this wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just to have extra social workers. We needed to do things more effectively. And the methods that social workers used, the kind of work they did, and the kind of outcomes they were likely to achieve came under increasing scrutiny in this time. Which I think, well, in the chapter I describe it as a golden opportunity for experimental research, mainly because up until this point, the kind of changes that had been implemented were massive. So there were things like giving local authorities powers to intervene and remove children, introducing foster carers as an alternative to children being at home. These kind of huge things that you don't need an effect size to see the difference. And that's kind of the first half of the 20th century. But in the second half of the 20th century, things became more incremental. So they weren't revolutionary, but they were kind of small changes that might make a small difference. So these are things that are less amenable to sort of just crude observation. And that's where experimental methods come in. And this quote from Barton is a good sort of summary of that on a bigger scale. So over the most of modern world history, humanity did not need evidence-based policy to make important progress in improving health and life around the globe. For things such as the money economy, as opposed to barter, rule of law, as opposed to autocracy or anarchy, and schooling of children, effects were so large that they could be directly observed without a rigorous evaluation. When you get down to kind of more subtle changes, that's no longer the case. So that's why I think there was a renewed interest in experimental methods in the sort of 60s, 70s period. And it also mirrored similar things going on in other fields. So in education, in criminology, in medicine, there was also a number of trials being done in this period. Medicine obviously went on to adopt the method very wholeheartedly. Another field that I think came a bit later, but has also become very associated with RCTs is international development. But as I'll say, criminology and social work particularly kind of went through another phase of not doing so many. But before I say that, we've got an interesting set of studies going on in the 1960s in New York. They all seem to be published in books at this point. So there's another book, one called Girls at Vocational High. It's kind of a similar intervention to the Cambridge Somerville study in that it was looking at offending behaviour. So it's an intervention that looked at trying to reduce offending, and it came out with a null finding. So it's essentially looking at social work methods and found that they didn't make the difference that they were intended to. And the authors were quite provocative. So pretty much the first line of the book asks the rhetorical question, is social work on the wrong track? And it kind of prompted quite a lot of debate and critique of the methods. So the critics were saying, this kind of facade of hard methodology, there's some soft thinking behind it. And there's a lot of discussion about what methods were appropriate in measuring outcomes, what outcomes were appropriate, the kinds of debates that we'd still be having today about, what sorts of things should we measure, that kind of stuff. So this created quite a lot of debate. It was quite an influential study. Another, probably even more influential study in the 60s, it was called Brief and Extended Casework by Reed and Shine. So this is a study that compared short-term intervention with long-term intervention. Now, another surprising finding, people expected longer-term social work intervention to be more effective, as opposed to kind of a short sort of time-limited intervention, where the client was kind of more in control. The social worker was kind of a facilitator. And what they found was actually the short-term intervention was more effective. And there's lots of explanations for that. People say, having a deadline, having a light at the end of the tunnel, these kinds of things are a motivating force for parents. But either way, it's had a really important impact on the profession. Reed, I think, went on to develop task-centered practice, which is kind of a fundamental approach to lots of different ways of doing social work. So intensive family support services are part of that. A lot of them have the same kind of short-term intervention philosophy. So that's had a really big impact on the profession. Then in the 70s, as far as I know, Tilda Goldberg did the first UK RCT in adult social care, and it was for elderly clients, and it found a positive finding for social work. So social work was compared with kind of a different type of support. It was like a lower level of professional support for elderly patients, and they found that social work was more effective. And Tilda Goldberg, actually, she's had quite a big impact. So she left a bequest in her will to set up a research centre focused on doing rigorous methods. And Donald, who's now director of Cascade, got that funding in 2010, I think, set up the Tilda Goldberg Centre at Bedfordshire. And I actually went to work there in 2011, and we did one of the more recent trials of motivational interviewing. So Tilda Goldberg's we've got a lot to thank her for, both in terms of being a trailblazer in the 70s and also leaving some money to continue that work. Okay, takes us to the 80s, when there was another downturn. Basically, things kind of stopped for 25 years. And this is really stark when you look at a couple of review papers. So Brian Sheldon and Geraldine MacDonald looked at the British Journal of Social Work in the 90s, and they found out of 350 or so papers, they didn't find any RCTs. And then similarly, another study looked at the same journal between 2000 and 2004. They found the same. And there's also some research that shows that there was a massive bias towards qualitative research and very few quantitative studies in general, so let alone RCTs, certainly in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think if you look across, like I say, it's quite often useful to look at related disciplines, so criminology, education, so on. And you see the same kind of patterns. There was a decline in criminology RCTs in the late 20th century. It's partly as a result of some influential researchers in the Home Office kind of lost faith in RCTs. I think they did a trial that had disappointing results. It's the same sort of theme. And the Home Office at the time kind of stopped funding RCTs in criminology. There were also concerns about ethics at the time, particularly in criminology, randomizing people in relation to crime outcomes. So all of these things together kind of created a downturn. And you can see the same in other fields like education as well. Like I said before, the opposite kind of happened in medicine and international development. They really sort of took off there. I think there's a few reasons for this. I've mentioned the ethics, sort of disappointing results. But I think there's a fundamental structural thing, which is that funders stopped funding it. And I think kind of on the opposite side of that, we've now got funders who are really keen on funding trials. I think there's a structural lesson there about how having that infrastructure and the sort of desire from policymakers to do RCTs and to fund them is a really important kind of factor in whether we do them or not. Okay. My mouse is doing funny things. Okay, so that brings us more or less to the present day, or at least the present century. So like I said before, they are getting more common. We've had more published in the 2010s than possibly the whole time up until that point, certainly a lot more than we had in the last 30 years. There's a few examples there. The method's been applied to different topics, quite a wide range of topics. So fostering, in particular, therapy. So we've seen some of the historical ones I've talked about have been about therapy. Tricia Jesselman did one looking at therapy for children with experience of sexual abuse in 2015. And also there's been some RCTs of training for professionals. So there's one there on the slide. The other one, which I'll hopefully talk about in a bit more detail shortly, is the motivational interviewing training trial that we did. But another, I think, sign that the field is sort of maturing is that as well as the actual studies, you also see more papers published on the kind of methodological challenges. And there's a classic here. I've put a sort of picture of it on the slide by Joe Dixon and colleagues. And this is a really good paper to understand the kind of problems that sometimes people have when they're doing trials, kind of practical problems, ethical problems. This is based on a study that kind of didn't go to plan. But I think it's a really interesting contribution in terms of how to overcome some of these difficulties. And I think the more recent trials have learned a lot from papers like that. The other big change, thinking about kind of infrastructure or structural factors, is the What Works network has been in place since I think about 2010. So this is a number of research centres that have a remit to increase the quality and amount of evidence in government, and they've got a particular interest in RCTs. They've got a lot of advantages because as well as funding evaluations, they fund costs for the interventions, and that the whole programme normally is geared towards generating evidence. So there's a big kind of advantage there in terms of making sure that they happen and overcoming some of the practical problems. And that's meant that some of the most most ambitious RCTs ever have been undertaken. I guess the downside to that is that policymakers often want things very quickly, sometimes too quickly, and the research process tends to be slower. So normally you'd want to do, a series of preparatory steps to get to the point where you could do an RCT, and that would include kind of feasibility studies, pilot trials, and so on. So there's a bit of a tension, I think, between the policymakers' desire for evidence very quickly and researchers' desire for the kind of proper, rigorous research and with the adequate preparation. But I think that's something that's kind of being figured out through this work. It's much more common now. I'd say it was standard practice to include qualitative methods as part of RCTs. So you end up with kind of what we might think of as a kind of modular trial with different modules. So you've got the trial module, you've got a qualitative process evaluation module. You might also have an economic evaluation module. And I think the trials are becoming much more kind of rounded in that sense. So as well as understanding the effectiveness, you've also got a good insight into implementation. Was it implemented well? How does the way it was implemented help us understand the results of the trial? And also the economic part is also super important, particularly for policymakers. So I think the modern trials are getting much better at answering different types of questions about interventions, rather than just are they effective. However, null findings, I've sort of mentioned this as a theme throughout, but they are obviously disappointing for people. And then sometimes they can kind of prompt a sort of retreat away from this method. But I think we need to embrace them as much as any other findings. Sometimes they can be more important because they tell us to stop doing something harmful. But they're often not given as much prominence as positive effects, understandably, but I think wrongly. Now I've got time to say a bit about this. So I've got a few recent studies. They're biased highlights because two of them I've been involved in. So the three on the slide here, the motivational interviewing study that I mentioned earlier, this is the study that the service manager said the rude thing about randomization. Despite that, we managed to negotiate access to do the study in Islington in London. And it was really interesting. We learned a lot. I think so. Donald Forrester led this, and there's a team of us involved. We learned a lot about doing this kind of study in a local authority, and I think it's certainly one of the rare studies, possibly the only one in the UK, to actually randomise kind of social work cases to field workers. There are other examples where there's a specific intervention, but this was randomising to kind of standard social work. And we looked at whether a particular training course in motivational interviewing, which is a communication style, would lead to higher skills being delivered by the social workers, communication skills, empathy, that sort of thing, and whether that would have an impact on family outcomes. We found that it did. The training course did increase skills, but that didn't translate to family outcomes. So that was an interesting finding. Like I said, I think we learned quite a lot. There was a chapter in the book Donald and I have put together that go into quite a lot of detail about the study and kind of what we learned, what we did wrong, what we do differently next time, and so on. So that's worth a read. The second one is, Claire mentioned this in my intro, it's the largest RCT in social work in the world, as far as I know. We've just published a paper in a journal called Research in Social Work Practice, which is an American journal. It was a school-based study, so we looked at whether putting social workers into schools would have an impact on outcomes for children and care outcomes and child protection outcomes. It involved nearly 300 schools, and we randomised at the school level, so it was a cluster trial, which I think in some ways can be easier than randomising individuals. There's sort of different challenges, I suppose, but in some ways it does get around some of the challenges of individual randomisation. That was also another finding, so we found that there's no difference between groups, so the intervention didn't seem to make a difference to the outcomes the policymakers were interested in. And that was funded by the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care, who are now foundations, and I think having funding from them and their involvement was really key to success, because they funded the intervention and they kind of oversaw the whole process and ensured that we had buy-in from the schools and the local authorities, which is crucial. The third one I wanted to mention to end on a sort of positive note is Sarah Taylor and colleagues' Family Group Conferencing RCT. So this ran pretty much in parallel with the Social Workers in School study, also funded by foundations, also pretty big. But they actually found a positive effect. So they found that family group conferencing, which is a type of intervention for involving families in decision making about children, was effective, and it improved outcomes for children. So that was a kind of a good example of a recent trial that's provided some positive evidence for the sector. I think since then, family group conferences have been expanded further on the basis of that evidence. Okay, in the last few minutes, before we go to questions, it strikes me that there's a number of things that we need to have in place if we want to continue doing RCTs in this field. Firstly, we need funders who want to fund RCTs and who understand and value the evidence they produce. So education is a good example of this. So the Education Endowment Fund, Education Endowment Foundation, have been going for a number of years. They were pretty much the first What Works centres. I think they're responsible for some huge proportion of education trials worldwide now, and I think it's a good example of how a committed funder can really sort of change the evidence base there. The Home Office have been funding trials through the Youth Endowment Fund. Their focus is in reducing youth violence. And recently, NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, has started funding social care trials, which I think is also a really exciting development. So I think that needs to continue. We also need capacities. I mentioned the sort of general lack of quantitative skills in social care. Jonathan Scatterfield did a study where, I can't remember the numbers now, which probably isn't very helpful, but he found a very small proportion of PhDs were quantitative, whereas a large proportion were qualitative. So we need to have the capacity in terms of skills, but also links with trials units. So we do a lot of work with the Cardiff Centre for Trials Research, and those kinds of collaborations are really important because they've got the expertise in doing trials. So I think that's an important kind of relationship to continue. There are lots of other trials units around the country as well. Around the UK. We also need, and this goes back to the quote from that service manager actually, we need local authorities who understand RCTs, what the purpose is, what the kind of challenges are, what the kind of benefits are, so you can kind of have a productive conversation about whether they're going to be involved and how they can be involved, and for them to kind of shape the way that the studies work, because it's critical for them to be happy with how things are going and what you're proposing to do. But it's also important for them to be sort of fully bought into it. And I think in Islington, we got to that point and took a lot of negotiation. But I think through those discussions, I think we ended up with quite a good collaboration. We also need a pipeline of interventions. So often you feel like you're sort of scratching around for interventions to test. Obviously, they have to be in a certain kind of position, so they can't be something brand new. You need to do a number of things first, feasibility studies, etc. But often I think we don't have enough things to test. So I think we need a pipeline for interventions that are kind of appropriate for doing an RCT. Outcomes are really important. We've got a seminar later here at Cardiff where we're going to talk a bit about outcomes, I think. Often people say you're measuring the wrong outcomes, but there are obviously some things that policymakers are interested in. There are some things that are important but difficult to measure. I think there's some learning to do about how to measure outcomes, how to conceptualize them, and that kind of thing. So I think there's definitely some more work to be done there. I mentioned the sort of different aspects of trials now, the process evaluation and stuff. I think integrating that and trying to make sure that these different bits aren't just totally disconnected, but actually sort of speak to each other is something that we can do more of. And then finally, recognizing that a null or a negative finding is just as important as a positive one. It's not a failure of the trial methodology, it's just an important thing to learn. And it can, lead to developments and adaptations of interventions that might then go on to be positive. So I've covered quite a lot of ground, and I'm sure you might have questions about bits of it. But this is a summary. So over the course of the last 100 years nearly, there's been these waves of interest in RCTs and then sort of downturns where they're not used so much. I think the ethical and practical challenges that people have come across are gradually being overcome. That's not to say they don't still exist and don't need lots of consideration, but I think they're being overcome, and the recent trials particularly are showing that you can do them at scale in an ethical way that is practically possible. I think institutional support, as I've said, is really important, and I think it's important to learn from the findings in terms of the types of evidence that you get at the other end, and make sure that's kind of communicated fully throughout the discipline, throughout the sector. Finally, I mentioned the book. I'm going to mention it again. This is not the actual cover, by the way. We haven't got a cover yet. It's going to look better than this, but this is an AI mock-up that I got. I got ChatGPT to do. So it gives you some idea of what it might look like, but it won't look quite like that. It's due to be published in September. Edward Elgar is the publisher, and I think the plan is to have a launch event in London, at King's College London, where Michael and Vanessa, who are the other two editors, are based, and we should be able to share details of that pretty soon. But thanks for listening. I think that is my last slide. I'll stop sharing and hand back over to Claire, who